Thanks very much. I want to thank everybody for coming today, and to the BHHA, and what was the other? Galesburg. Yeah, thanks to them for hosting and giving me this invitation to talk to you today. And I know several of you. It's always interesting to give a presentation about a community to that community. So it's an interesting thing for me. And I'm very excited to talk to you today. And I think some of you probably who've seen me talk before will recognize some of the themes. But this is basically, I'm presenting what will be a book chapter. It's kind of mostly stitched together here for a book that I'm writing about the contemporary culture of Bishop Hill and how we live with the history of a place like this, how we live with the kind of representations from tourism and tourists and what they perceive about a place like this that may or may not match with the actual reality of the history, right? And then also, you know, the Swedish perspective, because people in Sweden actually know about Bishop Hill, and it's part of their understanding of their own history of emigration to North America. And then, of course, also the fact that this massive wind farm has been built around the place, and so how we live with all of those kind of interesting kind of things happening all at once. So that's going to be what the book is about. So not necessarily a historical book, but a book about how we live with that history. So this is a chapter really focused on that particular theme from the book, and you'll probably be glad to hear I'm not going to read you the chapter. I'm going to read it just a little bit here at the beginning, and then I'll just talk, and then I'll read the concluding paragraph. So I won't bore you to death with that. You can go to the next slide here. So just to very briefly, I'm a cultural anthropologist, which means that I study contemporary human societies. And I have done that work primarily when I was a graduate student. I did my main ethnographic fieldwork in Ireland. So Swedish America is kind of a newer topic for me. It's a new kind of, well, new in the sense that I've been doing this for about 10 years now, but kind of, my previous work, there's me on a fishing boat, I lived in this little village called Doolin on the West Coast. It's a fishing village. And I'm really interested in tourism and how that economic activity, that kind of intercultural activity changes people's perceptions of themselves, right? So my question in Ireland was, how does all of this attention from tourists from all over the world coming to this little village change local people's perceptions of their own culture, right? Because you can imagine all of that attention, makes you think about yourself differently. And being a musician myself, I was really interested in traditional Irish music. So that was kind of the focus. How is it changing the music as an aspect of that culture? So that's really the primary work I had done before I came to this project.
What was the name of that village?
Doolin. It's right by the Cliffs of Moher. It's a really famous tourist site if anybody's been to Ireland. So it's just right at the base of the Cliffs of Moher. So it gets lots of tourism. There's a really rich history of traditional Irish music, so that's why I chose that spot. And in anthropology, what we do is we conduct what we call ethnographic fieldwork. So we're a qualitative social science. So we're not doing surveys usually. I actually do have a little survey data I will be presenting you. But typically what we do is we go and live in a place for a year or so. That's the ideal scenario. And you live like the local people do. So that's why I was out in a fishing boat. I wasn't studying fishing, but it's part of the community. So I was out there. Every time I go back, I hop on the fishing boat with this family I know. I usually get horribly seasick, by the way. So, I probably had just gotten done throwing up over the side of the boat when that picture was taken. But little tiny boats and choppy water and, horrible rotting fish smells. So it doesn't sit well with me. But anyway, so you kind of live like locals do. So I played music in the pubs. I actually worked in the pubs pulling pints of Guinness. And you do lots of interviews, and you just kind of what some people call like deep hanging out, for a year. And then you get to know the local culture, and then you write kind of an ethnography, a book about it. So that's what I did. So when I first got a job at Augustana College back in 2007, I was kind of looking around for local project, and everybody kept telling me about Bishop Hill. So I started coming out here, and the idea was to kind of apply some of those same questions to a different community. And of course here, I mean, the issues are different, and we always want to think about Bishop Hill as a very unique place, right? People like to talk about this really unique history, and it's true. Nobody has the particular history, the founding story that Bishop Hill has, right? It is very unique. And yet, in touristy places all over the world, you see similar patterns of, how people kind of start rethinking their own culture based on all this attention that people kind of give it, right? And so new representations of the culture emerge, and sometimes misrepresentations, right? So this is kind of what I want to talk about today. So I'm just going to read just for a second here. While Bishop Hill is very unique in many ways, some of the same issues that affect tourist destinations in communities all over the world can be seen right here as well. So off and on for over a decade, with a friend of mine and a colleague who's a political scientist, she and I have been doing this work, conducting the study of the community, the preservation and interpretation of its history, and recent changes in the village, like the introduction of the wind farm that now surrounds it. This is leading up to a book that we're very slowly working on. We're just kind of picking away at it. Since I live nearby, I don't need to spend the year living in the village. So for a decade, I've been kind of driving out here and doing this work. And we're tentatively calling this book Becoming Utopia, kind of after the common saying that we have about Bishop Hill, that it's the utopia on the prairie. So Bishop Hill is what we in the academic study of tourism would call a heritage tourism destination. In Bishop Hill, heritage can refer to the story of the community's founding, in this case, the colony days, and it can also refer to the built environment. So the buildings themselves, like the one we're in right now, that have been so lovingly restored and preserved over the last 60 years or more. And then added to this mix, of course, is what we might call festival tourism. Since members of the community here have developed such a rich annual cycle of events that draw regional public to the community. And other attractions, of course, include the artists and the artisans who've taken up residence. So in one way, I always think of Bishop Hill as, a former colony, but now it's an artist colony. It's kind of gone from one form of a colony to another, offering handmade craft works, artistic works, and artisan foods. But today, I want to focus on this notion of heritage, what exactly heritage is and what it means, and how it's different from history itself. So we could go to the next slide there. So yeah, this is, I guess, what I was just talking about, and we can go to the next slide. So the difference between history and heritage, at least in my thinking, and some other scholars who think about this. So if we want to think about history as the basic things that happened in the past, right? Take yourselves back to that colony era in the 1840s. And life was ticking along. It was an adventure. But it was serendipitous. And it wasn't predestined or anything. It was people, led really complex lives, and they were just trying to establish themselves, and things went along. And people wrote about it in their diaries and letters back home. These become the documents that historians use to try to figure out what happened in the past. That's history, right? History is our attempt to understand those facts of the past. And, professional historians, which I am not, by the way, I'm an anthropologist, I'm not a professional historian, but my colleagues in the history department do a very careful analytical job examining those documents, examining people's stories, artifacts. Archaeologists can come in and dig up artifacts and, add to the information we have. And like detectives, you piece together possibly what happened, and you write narratives about it that you think are probably the best, most accurate stories about the past. Okay, so that's history. As an anthropologist, I'm more interested in what I'm going to call heritage, which is like our contemporary understanding, or misunderstanding occasionally, of what happened in the past. How are we using history today for our own contemporary purposes? How do we make use of it for things like tourism? Right? So that's actually what I'm interested in here in this book and in the presentation today. And, the fact of the matter is, even historians have to kind of create interpretations and narratives about the facts and the documents, right? But in something like a tourism industry, you're kind of selling a product about that history. And so, there's simplifications perhaps. And sometimes, as we'll see in just a second, tourists themselves might have kind of wild imaginations about what was going on in the past. So you end up with kind of misrepresentations too. And this process of turning history into heritage requires a couple of things. One is remembering what happened in the past, like a good historian would do. But sometimes it requires amnesia, forgetting what happened in the past, right? So heritage is in part about elevating certain aspects of the past and kind of forgetting some other things, right? So today I'm going to use a couple of different examples. So you can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about tourism and what that does to our understanding of history today. I'm going to talk about Olaf Kron and his paintings and what that might do to our understanding of the past. And then I'm going to talk about buildings like this one and what the preservation process does. If you think about preservation, you're literally preserving parts of the building, but not others, right? You might actually consider parts of the old building literally trash and throw it away, right? And you might add things like the light system here, or I can feel there's a heating system in this building right now. That wouldn't have been from 1846, right? So we're making choices here, right? So we'll start with tourism. What does tourism do to our understanding of the past? So you can go to the next slide here. So one question we can ask is, what do tourists experience when they come to a place like this, right? Especially heritage tourists, people who are actively motivated by going out to experience historical sites, right? What do they see in a place like this? What are they filtering out? And what are they trying not to see? So we can go to the next slide. So back in 2010, I did more intensive work on this question. And I purposely didn't want to learn too much about the actual history of Bishop Hill to sort of bias myself in a way by the facts, So I spent a whole summer following tourists around. So I would kind of get people from the Quad Cities or Peoria to, allow me to walk around and photograph them and, see what I was trying to see what they were seeing. And then I'd interview them. And I did a survey as well. So even though I said I'm not a quantitative guy, I had my sociology colleagues help me construct a survey. And so I studied, that tourist experience of the place. And I heard a lot of things like this. This is an example of a quote from an interview that I did, where this woman, who's actually looking into the window of this building, ironically, before it was preserved and renovated. And she said, I always say to myself, what was it like back then? She's imagining, right, what it was like back then. She'd never been here before, by the way. And she didn't know much about the history until she got here. And yet she's trying to picture in her mind images that she's making up, clearly, of what it would have been like. Here we are standing here. This structure is still the same, she says. But what did everything around it look like? What was going on around this place when people still lived here? Sometimes you can catch that individual feeling. And that makes me feel emotionally charged, right? She's having like this emotional experience about something that she literally knew nothing about, let's say an hour before she arrived in town, right? And this is what we do, right? I'm not criticizing this. This is kind of, but I want to become aware of this. I want people to kind of become aware of what we're doing when we're tourists. We go to places and our imagination is incredibly influential on what we're literally seeing in the landscape or in a townscape, right? So we can go to the next slide. And, from another interview here with somebody who runs a business in town, I think this is telling too, that we've always had this kind of tightrope between people coming to shop and do commercial things and people coming for the history. So you're trying to balance, obviously tourism is an industry, right? You're trying to make money. Obviously, you're trying to provide a product. There's a commercial aspect to it. So you're trying to provide experiences for the tourists. And so, when I can stand here and say that somebody is a heritage tourist. Well, what does that really mean? I don't even like those kind of labels, to be quite honest, because even if you're interested in the history of a place, in 1 second, you could be shopping for pottery, over the next building over there, and also be interested in history itself, and also the landscape, and also, you can kind of be multiple types of tourists all in one. So I don't like kind of pinpointing tourists as a single thing, right? But this quote, I think, kind of highlights the fact that, you're trying to balance lots of different activities and experiences in a community like this, and also educate people about the reality of that history. And it's in that mix that sometimes this slippage between history and heritage can happen. Next slide, please. And this is some data. This is just one data point from the survey that I did. And what I want to point out here is, and I'll show you kind of some more specifics here, but what became very clear from this data to me was that people often said that they're interested in the history of a place like Bishop Hill. And yet, when you ask about specific aspects of that history, what you find is they're really more interested in what I'm calling heritage, the contemporary experience of history rather than history itself. So let me explain that a bit more clearly. Those first 2 bars way over on the left, the first thing is dining. So first of all, people are really, they come out here for lunch, right? Like John and I just did. We just had lunch at the filling station. That is a huge aspect of why people come to Bishop Hill, right? That's the reality. The second thing is history. Okay, so there we might think, well, obviously people are really interested in that history, but let's dig into the data a bit more. If you start kind of going to the left here, you've got architecture. Okay, so people want to take pictures of the architecture. Shopping. Swedish heritage is up there, but what does that mean really? That could mean lots of things. As you dig down here, this might be kind of hard to read back there, but you've got festival activities, the early communal society, that's a pretty good one, but it's pretty far to the right over here. Immigration history, now that's specific, right? That's, so the communal society, the immigration history, the Johnsonist religion, which was the founding reason why people came here. That's the lowest down, right? If you combine a bunch of those specific things, dining is actually bigger than all those things combined. So while people are saying, I'm really interested in the history, what do they mean by that? When you get really specific with them, they're less interested, actually. So the reality of the tourist interest in a place like this is a kind of light touch version of history. They want to get a bit of that, but really they want to go to the bakery and have some soup, and right? And that's just the reality. Again, I'm not criticizing it, but that's what motivates people. So we can go to the next slide. So heritage, that kind of not a deep understanding of history, but that experience of heritage in the contemporary moment is more important to people. And people are filtering their experience of a place like this through those imagined ideas of what history was and what actually happened here. But this is a common thing in any tourist setting, what we call framing. And I did this myself, so I didn't pull this from a tourist. Although, I guess I'm a tourist here too. So, but this is my own photography. And this is a very common, I just did this to kind of create an example here for you. But this is a common thing that people do literally with their photographs, but more figuratively in their heads, in their imaginations about their experience of a place, a tourist setting. They'll kind of filter out certain things and highlight others. So, and often this is fed to them by the tourism industry itself. So brochures, a website, Rick Steves' tour guide book, or whatever it is, right? You read this little passage about a village like the one I lived in Ireland, and it's half a page or something. It's going to tell you, apparently the whole history of the village, like a crunched down little tiny abstract. That gives you this powerful, authoritative sense of what the place is like, but really it's very simplified. So people then enter a place like that and they think they know because Rick Steves told them what that place is all about. Right? So we're framing, we're filtering, we're kind of forgetting some things and elevating others in this process of creating heritage, right? So here we have a brochure that I picked up out here of the church there, picture of the church. And I purposely staged this, but this is a common thing that tourists do. And you might have done this yourself, where you're like, we call it postcarding in my discipline, where you try to find the exact place where the postcard picture was taken of the Greek church or whatever, and like, there it is. You want to capture that image, and because it's been made famous for you by the tourism industry. So I postcarded the church here. So I took this picture in the middle that resembles the pamphlet on the left, and then I Instagrammed it to see what would happen. I put it up on Instagram. I was really sad. I didn't get very many likes on it, but anyway. So there it is, and I literally used a camera filter to make it look really nice. So you can go to the next slide. This is the picture I took before I cropped it, right? And of course, here you have the tavern, right? This Quonset hut, kind of mid-century structure, was not part of the colony, right? So this is a common activity that tourists do. I have to admit, in that first period of fieldwork that I did out here with the tourists, I really didn't even really properly look at the tavern. I have to admit, it took me like a year or so, and I'm like, oh yeah, there's a bar out there. That's right. I was so focused myself, being a newbie to the town, on the colony buildings. I just like a tourist, I was fascinated by the story of the colony days and the beautiful architecture from the colony days. And it just kind of, I just wasn't looking at the tavern, right? But of course, the tavern is a part of this community, right? Yeah, it's like, it's an important, for some people, that is the center of this community, of course, right? So we can't not look at that. But the sort of tourist imagining of a place is cropping, literally or figuratively, certain things out of the frame. So, and you can go to the next slide. And of course, for some people, these are actually pictures from the museum, but if you go in the tavern, if you've been in the tavern, you know that there's photographs of the old Bishop Hill baseball. And that's a huge part of the history here too, right? That's an important part of the contemporary heritage and identity of Bishop Hill, is this amazing history of baseball. And I love those photographs in there. They go back to the 1900s, I think, like 1907 or something, these old-timey baseball guys. That's a really fascinating bit of the history here too. But for people who come here for, what they're calling history, it's usually that colony period of history, right? But for some other people, the baseball that's their sense of place. That's their sense of the history of this community. So, and really, if you think about the baseball, this is an important part of what happened to those early colonists too. They wanted to assimilate to some extent to American society. And after the dissolution of the colony, that was an important thing. They became Methodists. They wanted to learn how to play baseball. They wanted to learn English right away as soon as they established the community. So there was this kind of Swedishness to it, but there was a real drive actually to assimilate. And I think baseball, for me, symbolically as an anthropologist, I think about the town square and the site where the old baseball, where the baseball park is right now, sitting side by side. For me, that's really symbolic of this kind of the Swedish colony days and the sort of Americanizing version of Bishop Hill, kind of right next to each other. So, for their alternate heritages here is kind of my point. That sometimes we filter out. So you can go to the next slide. And, we're sort of leaving things out and leaving certain people out of our histories sometimes too, that are not historic, perhaps, that are more contemporary kind of building structures like this trailer home. So you go to the next slide. And that's true in places like Ireland too. Often tourists will be driving around Ireland, and I've heard this so many times, American tourists perhaps, who look at these little thatched cottages and they're, oh, it's so beautiful. And they are beautiful. They're beautiful structures. And then they see all these new big American-style suburban houses that have been built. And they're like, oh, why don't they all live in the nice thatched cottages? It's too bad these ugly American-style houses are, And I always want to say, yeah, but have you ever been in one of those cottages? It's cold, it's damp, the windows are like this big, there's no vitamin D coming through. And, You know, you want to heat your house with coal or peat turf. I mean, people do that, but it's not pleasant. So you can't really blame people for wanting a big new home, right? But the tourist imagination is kind of filtering that out, and they want to just see that beautiful little cottage. So we do this constantly in our travels and imaginations about other societies and other time periods, right? So here's just to kind of give you a few more examples of this tourist framing. This is from a tourist guidebook, 2014, about Henry County. And I won't read the whole thing here, but I want to just highlight this idea, the fertile farm ground around here and the promise of the good life, right? Very romantic kind of language, which is common for tourist narratives. Drew early pioneers to settle Henry County. Dotting the scenery are small towns and villages telling the stories of the land. Very, very poetic language here. A visit to Henry County will conjure thoughts of a simpler time, right? That's a very common phrase. And, you know, this is from a quote, actually, from an interview I did. Very similar kind of sentiment. You have people who are just interested in the time period that Bishop Hill represents. I think that word represents is doing a lot of work in this quote, you know. People are interested in what Bishop Hill represents to them. Not in what it maybe is, but what it represents to them, right? So that's a really interesting word, inclusion of that word. I mean, we represent 1850s rural Americana. And there are some people who are interested in that time period, a simpler time before the Civil War. So this idea of a simpler time, of small communities in rural America being simpler, it's actually a fairly common thing that's not unique at all to Bishop Hill or the American Midwest. I mean, people, again, I've heard that said about Ireland and the little village that I lived in there. You know, oh, times were simpler. Really? I mean, when were they simple? Back in the 1940s, back in the 1930s, people were completely impoverished. There was just a bloody civil war and a revolution against Britain. You know, I mean, like, what's emigration? Like, what's simple about that? It was horribly complicated, actually. So you can go to the next slide. And if we apply that notion to Bishop Hill, let's ask ourselves what was so simple about the 1840s in Bishop Hill. I mean, you had just had the Black Hawk Wars that had, you know, and that was a bloody, bloody confrontation on both sides, really. I mean, but especially for the Sauk and Fox people, you know, that had just happened. We're talking about the clearance of the landscape of Native people here. I mean, that was within a decade of the foundation of Bishop Hill. That had just happened. So, and then Eric Johnson, who, you know, if you know the history of Bishop Hill, he wasn't just a kind of radical Lutheran. I mean, he thought he was the second coming of Christ. You know, I mean, this is not your typical religious tradition. And, you know, so he and his followers came here and, you know, they were kind of known for book burnings and mass weddings and things, you know, I mean, this again was not mainstream Lutheranism, right? So that's not simple, right? And then just in that early history of those colony days, I mean, you had John Root, who was in love with, well, there's debate about that and what their relationship was really like, but with Eric Johnson's niece. And he literally got a posse together to charge into town on horseback to kidnap her, right? Which failed, apparently. And then he later shot and murdered Eric Johnson at the county courthouse in Cambridge. You know, and people brought Johnson back to the church and they thought he'd rise after 3 days. And there's a historian who says the only thing that rose was the stench, right? I mean, and then he's buried over here and it says, murdered 1850, right? I mean, dramatic. This is exciting, dramatic stuff. It's not simple, right? And then the U.S. Civil War breaks out a few years later. I mean, so it's interesting to me, if you think about that quote, that's where I think that word represents is doing so much work. And I think it's so interesting that in that interview, somebody said to me that, you know, people come here to experience something that represents simpler times, right? We're looking for something that wasn't really there, though. You know, people's lives are always fairly complicated. And that was a very complicated situation and a very complicated era in American history. So it's interesting to me that we've kind of forgotten, purposely forgotten perhaps, a lot of that complication. So we can go to the next slide. And, there's an Americanization to that simplification too. So part of what we're wanting to see is the broader, I don't mean this again in a judgmental way, but the broader myths of American society, right? The broader grand narratives about freedom, religious freedom in this case, perhaps, about individual liberty, those kinds of things we tell ourselves are the core values of American society. We want to put those values onto those early colonists whenever we find the opportunity to do so. So here's a couple of examples, again from a brochure. One that says, they came looking for a place to worship as they chose. They discovered a new challenge to their faith, American freedom. Right? That's an interesting kind of way of telling this story. That what they came here for religious freedom, but what they found was Americanness, right? This American sense of individual freedom, and that's what lasted, not the religion, right? And then this is the Pioneer Monument, which I think is in the village square. It's in Swedish, but the translation, dedicated to the memory of the hardy pioneers. We want to think of these as sodbusters, who, in order to secure religious liberty, again, that religious freedom, left Sweden, their native land, with all their endearments of home and kindred, and founded Bishop Hill Colony on the uninhabited prairies of Illinois. Well, technically true. Just barely. I mean, it was just barely uninhabited, right? And probably not completely uninhabited. There were probably, remnant, Sauk and Fox people and other native people around. So these are examples of that kind of Americanizing process in that whole switch from history to heritage. So next slide, please. So those are some examples of how contemporary tourism and tourist representations kind of enact this process of heritage making. I want to talk briefly about Olaf Kron's amazing artist. Now, finally, I think, becoming fully recognized as a really important early folk artist in the history of American folk art. And his paintings are incredible. You've probably all, I assume you're here because you're really interested in this stuff, and you've probably gone to the museum and seen them all. But it is just absolutely worth a visit. I'm always blown away by that museum and his paintings. And he did a lot of paintings, of course, of the landscape, of individuals that he knew or remembered. And then he did a lot of paintings of the work that was done at Bishop Hill, like these two paintings here of sowing and harvesting. Next slide, please. And so here he is, the man himself on the left. And he probably did more portrait painting than anything. And that's interesting in and of itself. I'm kind of more interested in these kind of landscape and sort of work scenes that he does. So we can go to the next one. So you could tell he really wanted to be like, a professional painter, but there's something kind of folksy about his style. It's not quite accurate, the facial features. You could tell he wasn't classically trained. He didn't go off to Paris or whatever, right? He was self-taught, an excellent self-taught painter, but it's not, this is not Monet, right? So we consider it folk art. So he's got these depictions, lots of depictions of the colony days, that he mostly started painting. He did a few things. He was a sign painter, actually, first. But then he started painting these scenes mostly in 1896 and afterwards, at the 50-year kind of anniversary, really, of the founding of Bishop Hill. So this is 50 years on. And he was a little boy. He wasn't there right in 1846. I think he arrived in like 1850 or 1851. One of you might know. So it was a little later, and he was a little boy. So he was there for the colony days. But this is his childhood, right? And I don't know about you, but I have all sorts of memories of my childhood that may or may not be true. I mean, you sort of filter it and you get nostalgic about it, right? And he tried to go around and he would talk to some of the elders who were adults then, and, what was it like to drive the oxen and break the sod, or, do the pile driving to, put a post in to build a bridge or whatever, right? He was trying to do some careful historical work there, but it's true that a lot of this is through his own memory. as well, and through the memory of other people, right? So next slide. So, how ethnographic or historical are these depictions? You've got to come to the conclusion that it's a bit of both, really. He attempted to be as accurate as he could, but, he was also, kind of colorfully representing the town as well, a bit. And at best, it's really a second or sometimes third-hand depiction of what the colony life was really, really like. Some art historians, Esther Sparks here, in a recent kind of catalog overview of Olaf Kron's work, described his work as undisguised nostalgia, right? I mean, in some ways, not completely, but some depictions are just like, yeah, he's just leaning right into like this romanticized version of what the colony life might have been, right? So you really kind of have to, at best, conclude that there's some accuracy here, but there's also a lot of kind of nostalgia and kind of romanticizing. So, but if you go to the next slide, of course, we use Olaf Kron. I mean, my gosh, I keep imagining getting permission to use one of Olaf Kron's paintings for the cover of this book I'm writing. I really want to, because they're gorgeous, right? But we use those paintings today to create a sense of that colony, when in fact, it's 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes, versions removed from the lived experience of the colony days. So if we're truly interested in history, not heritage, we have to admit that these depictions, these images are really filtered through time. And the way they're used in postcards and pamphlets, we're still cropping them and doing all sorts of things to them, right? Manipulating them for contemporary purposes. So that's another example of how Bishop Hill is kind of filtering itself, and others are filtering it for contemporary purposes. And one final thing, back to the native presence here. There's one really I'm just obsessed with this story and this visual depiction of the story that Olaf Kron's painted. This is a painting called Hellbomb in the Indian from 1896. So this is one of the first things he painted in that era. And I don't know if you can see it here, but what you have is a native person, or what looks like a native person, because one of the versions of this story says that this is actually a Swede, or no, not a Swede, but one of John Root's posse members who dressed up as a native person to scare the crap out of the local Bishop Hill Swedes. That's one of the you don't hear that version of the tale as much. The more common tale is that there was an actual native person wandering around, or a band of native people wandering around outside the village, and everybody was scared, right? I mean, this, again, is just a few years after the Black Hawk War had ended. And so what they did, and it's just silly, and it's meant to be a comic tale, so it's meant to make you laugh. And it's technically what we call a legend, because it may or may not have happened, but people tell the tale a lot. So what they did was they sent out the biggest Swede they could find from Bishop Hill, Hellbomb, Mr. Hellbomb, and they dressed him up in a bearskin coat with a bearskin hat, to go confront the native person. And you see, you probably can't see it here, but the native man has a knife, and you see this Hellbomb guy kind of acting like a bear. I mean, it's menacing. This is a menacing image, right? And but it's silly to some extent if you really think about what native people would have known about the settlers here, and also bears. There's no way they would have thought, oh no, a bear, I'm going to run away, right? I mean, so it's kind of it's a funny tale for that reason too, right? But it's kind of just a hint, even though it's a legend and we don't even know if it really happened. It's a hint that there was a consciousness here about native people being around, even if it was the other version that was true, where it was John Root's posse member that dressed up as a native person. This was a common thing to do because there was so much interaction between white settlers and native people that playing Indian goes all the way back to the Boston Tea Party, for example, and it goes right up to today with mascots or whatever. Like, this is a common white thing to do, basically, is to play Indian. So either way, there is a kind of interaction here and a consciousness that is revealed in a painting like this, in a legend like that one, that otherwise gets erased. I could flip back, don't do it, but we could flip back to that earlier slide where it's like the uninhabited prairies, right? Okay, what's going on here? you have a kind of a contradiction here between this image and this tale and those narratives, right? Fox.
Every time I see this picture, I do laugh.
It's silly.
If I were a native person, as I am, and somebody tried to scare me dressed as a bear, I would think dinner.
Exactly. Or like clan totem, and I respect you, and maybe try to, but you wouldn't, the idea that that would actually have been convincing is just silly. It's silly. So, and it was meant to be, it was a tale that Bishop Hillers told themselves, and, it's hard to know if they really thought that Native people were that simple-minded or whatever, but yeah, it reveals something else to me about why they were telling a tale like that. So I think you can see little hints of the, kind of through that filtration process of creating heritage in an image like that. So next slide, please. The last thing I want to talk about is this preservation process, historical preservation. So, here's a couple of images of the village. You can go to the next slide. And of course, I love this, the delicious irony of giving a talk about historic preservation in a building that was just recently preserved. So it's great. But if you think about buildings, you think, well, how much more solidly historic can you get? It's bricks, it's floorboards. You look at these pine floorboards and you think, I can't buy that. Menards, that's historic. And it's very true that those bricks were fashioned by hand. These floorboards were hewn by hand, and you can just tell by looking at them. So how could we have a filtering going on at all in something that's just solidly, you can touch it and feel it. It's solidly historic, right? But if you think about preservation as a contemporary activity, you start kind of realizing that, there is kind of a filtering that's going on here too. So preservation itself is a modern philosophy. It's a modern set of policies that, the state will tell you, or the National Historic Register will tell you are acceptable or unacceptable, right? The fact that there are those parameters and those ideas about what preservation, we could almost say preservation with a capital P, it's like a proper noun. That's a contemporary idea and a contemporary process, which means that it's not a historic one, right? So how people preserve things, the choices that we make in preserving a home or a building like this one, is a contemporary one, right? So going through the IHPA rules or the Bishop Hill Historic District or the National Historic Register or whatever, all of these things limit our choices. So go to the next slide. I'll give you a couple of examples of this as well. So here's a quote from an interview that I did that kind of highlights this. There's this gentlewoman's agreement that the external of a building cannot change. And this is common, actually, in the current preservation policies all over the place. That we want to keep the buildings and the look of the town the same, but at the same time, the building committee, when you go for approval, it's perfectly fine to do whatever you want to the inside of the building. Same thing is true on the campus of Augustana College. We recently renovated Old Main, if you've been to campus. Beautiful, big old, limestone structure that's based architecturally on the state capitol in Springfield, big domed kind of thing. And, it's on the National Historic Register, or the state, I forget which one, but it follows these same strictures. So we renovated it, really needed it. They had to keep the outside exactly the same. They couldn't change the way the outside looked, but they gutted the inside. Absolutely gutted it. And, it's really modern. It's really nice. The classrooms are really comfortable and the offices are all, really clean and whatever. So it's really functional. But, I've heard people say, it looks like the inside of a bank or something. It looks like, it's a modern interior, right? And there's good reasons to do that. Again, there used to be fireplaces in the classrooms when I first started teaching there before they renovated it. Imagine, let's preserve it exactly the way it was in 1860, whatever, right? We'd have like a fire, in December at final exams. Nobody wants that, right? Like, we're making choices to be functional, right? Yeah, so Yeah, exactly, right? Like, what level of historical accuracy do we want here, right? I mean, there's always, of course, there's a balance there between contemporary needs for lighting and, HVAC systems and all that stuff, and preserving some of it, right? But that's a choice we're making. And, people could choose to preserve the interiors to one level or another, but, they are probably putting in air conditioning systems or whatever, right? So that's a contemporary process. Next slide, please. And here, sorry, this is a fairly long quote, but this is a story somebody told me in an interview as well. There's a house in the historic district that they wanted to side it with vinyl siding. And at first, the historic board said, absolutely not. That is not anywhere close to historic. Well, the homeowners had samples with them, and they said, this is what the siding looks like. And just like the wood siding, except it's vinyl, it's maintenance free. Right? This is the window trim we're going to use. It's vinyl, but it looks original from the street, right? And they, they looked at it and they liked the color and they were all for it. And they decided, yeah. So they're starting to allow homeowners to do more, right? So this is a negotiation, right? People are negotiating the level to which preservation happens. The fact that they're negotiating in the contemporary moment, that is this process I'm talking about here, between what is historic. And we're talking about, things that are physical objects now. What are we deciding is historic and what are we deciding looks historic, right? It's representing a time, from the past, right? So next slide. So even our preservation process is a process of making heritage. So here's a quote from a scholar, Ashworth, who writes, heritage is not about a special category of artifacts, objects, sites, historical events, or personalities. It is a process, an outcome, and a consumable experience, right? Tourism industry is about consuming a place like this. And it's created in the present to serve contemporary needs, right? So that's really what we're doing in part in a place like Bishop Hill. So next slide. And I said I was going to just read the last paragraph of this chapter, and then we can kind of open it up for questions. Here we go. So what should we make of all this untangling of history and heritage? Should it cause us anxiety that what we once saw simply as historical fact, the names and dates version of history, right? Just give me the facts, names and dates, is filtered through a complex web of contemporary reimaginings, reinterpretations, and sometimes willful projections of our own contemporary values, politics, and concerns, right? Sometimes people are really projecting what they want to see about the past onto their retellings of the past. Let's be absolutely clear. We're not arguing that history is unknowable or that careful and critical accountings of history are hopelessly biased. Let's not give up on the process of trying to understand history. We can agree on history's names and dates. But who those people were and what happened in those days, on those days, requires interpretation. The interpretation of the past is very much a modern process, whether it results in good, careful, analytical, historical accounts, or instead romantic, sometimes whitewashed, stories which might better resemble what folklorists call legends. Sorry, I lost my place there. And we can all agree on the fact that these bricks and these floorboards were hewn by Bishop Hill's original colonists, but we also need to recognize that today we actively choose which bricks to preserve and when to use vinyl siding instead. By fully understanding the processes by which history becomes heritage in a tourist setting, such as Bishop Hill, there's an opportunity to become much more humble, critical thinkers about our interpretations of what actually happened in the past. In one sense, there's a deep irony in what we're arguing. If we allow ourselves to finally let go of the ultimately fruitless, I think, goal of arriving at some sort of singular, authoritative, supposedly authentic, true with a capital T version about what happened in a place like Bishop Hill, when we instead fully acknowledge the important asterisks of historical epistemology, or how we know what we know about the past, that the stories we tell are influenced by our own contemporary political and cultural zeitgeist. The irony is that this will allow us to tell a more honest story, a more accurate history, by allowing, just let's admit our limitations, right? That we are influenced by our contemporary concerns. Put another way, we are not arguing that our analysis of history becoming heritage means that historical narratives are all biased. Quite the opposite. We are arguing that unless we study this process of heritage making, we greatly increase the possibility of amplifying misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the past. So we should really become aware of what we're up to here. If we truly want to understand the colony days, for example, we really need to just fully embrace the fact that we use history today for other purposes rather than telling the names and dates alone, right? We're interpreting. It's often said that Bishop Hill is a historical community, but it's not a theme park. It's very true, right? People live here. It's a living community. But what does this really mean? Embracing a more fluid and complicated understanding of history and heritage is what a living history really looks like. And it is also what living with history really looks like. So that's it. Thanks. Thank you.